Wow, look at this audience. Thank you guys so much for having me today. Thanks, Bruno. So before I jump into the topic at hand, I do like to start with a content warning, because we are going to cover some difficult subjects today, including war, near-death experiences, medical crises, terrorism, and natural disasters. Now, please note that every story that was chosen today was chosen with the intention to teach. It is my hope that by examining tragedies of the past, we can better serve our fellow humans moving into the future. Okay, so first story is about this guy, Neil Armstrong. You may have heard of him. Before he took his very first steps on the moon, the very first steps on the moon, he was a young hotshot fighter pilot for the US Navy in the Korean War. So we're talking 1950s here. And when he was in that war, one of the planes he flew was this one, the F-9F Panther fighter jet. So Armstrong is out one day, and he gets in a deadly dogfight with the enemy, and half of his right wing is sheared off. So through some truly spectacular flying, he is able to keep that plane in the air. But it is just his rate of speed that is keeping him from going into an uncontrolled roll and spinning out of control and crashing. So if he can't slow down, he can't land, right? So he gets on the radio with his commanding officer, and they decide what he should do is to fly back towards the US base, eject from the plane over the fields outside, and just let his plane crash into the ocean. So that's what he does. So he turns back, goes back to the US base. On his way there, he realizes he'd only had very basic training in the ejection procedures for the plane he is currently flying. So what does he do? He pulls out the instruction manual, no joke, and reads about the instructions and reviews them in the plane while he is flying over enemy territory. And by God, the man pulls it off. This is a picture of Armstrong standing in a rice paddy outside the US naval base. He is holding the D-ring from his parachute there in his hand, so he made it back. Now, I love this story. As a designer who spent the last 3 years researching designing for stressful situations, when I first heard this story, the thing I wanted to know most is, what was the design of those instructions? What did they look like? I was actually able to dig it up. So this is the instruction sheet from that F-9F Panther manual. Now, this is a fantastic example of crisis design. It follows all of the rules in the research. First of all, it's got this lovely singular linear design that goes down the page from upper left to lower right, starting with a very clear call to action. Reduce airspeed if possible. You know exactly where to start. It uses a nice mix of short phrases and short words and mixes up with images and words together, kind of playing off of each other going down the page. And it's got this really delightful use of color. So that red, right, we're in the era of two-toned printing, and that red really draws your eye to the part of the illustration that is the most important. This is a fantastic example of crisis design. There's so much to learn from pieces out there that are specifically designed to work for stress. And that's the topic of this next 25 minutes or so, stress. It is in some ways a great uniter because every human on the planet experiences it. But stress changes us. It changes the way we think, the way we move. It changes the choices that we make. And so as designers, it is critical that we understand those changes and how to accommodate for them in our designs. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at fields like aviation and medical and military, where the effects of stress and design are incredibly well studied through human factors research. And we're going to see what things we can pluck out of that research and apply to other high-stress situations. Maybe you design for high-stress professionals like day traders or customer service reps. Talk about a stressful job. Maybe you design an app and it just has one feature meant to be used in a stressful moment, like after a car crash. Or maybe what you design shouldn't be stressful at all, and nevertheless, people are coming to your design in a stressed-out state of mind because, you know, the world right now. There are four main ways that we can approach designing for the stressful situations. The first is to try to harness So an adrenaline rush is a powerful force of nature, and a smart design can actually put that to use for the user. And sometimes though you can't do that, but so you want to think about ways that you can suppress it, either reduce it or eliminate the stress altogether. Other times you might think about trying to protect your user. When they are panicked and they are running on pure adrenaline, they are not necessarily their best selves or thinking rationally. So how as designers can we protect them in those moments? And finally, calm. How can we bring them back to a place where they can be their best selves again? Okay, let's start with a specific example, starting with trying to harness the amazing human potential that is sometimes unlocked in a moment of crisis, otherwise known as dad reflexes. Now, if you Google dad reflexes, you will find hundreds of examples of guys saving their offsprings from injury or certain death through purely reflexive reactions. Now, it is tempting to think that parenthood may somehow unlock something in these guys, but the fact of the matter is, it was always inside them. These reflexes are inside each of us. So as designers, how do we take advantage of them? How do we harness them? Well, the first thing we have to do is to understand under what circumstances can these reflexes actually help. So as of the 2012 Olympic Games, a starter pistol was no longer used to signal the start of the race. And this was in part because of a study done by the University of Alberta that showed that runners who were right next to the starter gun were getting an unfair advantage, their starter reflex. That bang of the opening gun was getting those runners off the starting block an average of 18 milliseconds faster than the runners who were farther away. Now, 18 milliseconds isn't much, right? A millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. But in the world of high-performance sports, this can be the difference between silver and gold. Now, if you are planning to try to harness this in your own designs, it's critical that you understand that not every type of movement is equally improved by the startle reflex. So in this other study, they compared arm movements versus finger movements. And when the startle reflex is introduced in the arm study, the time goes down and down. It gets faster and faster as the startle is introduced. But in the finger study, the time flatlines. There is no improvement when the startle is introduced. And in fact, the finger movements get less accurate. So there's actually a drawback to things using those fine motor skills. Because our systems have evolved to help us with fight or flight, running or punching, gross motor movements. And they're actually drawing extra energy from our fine motor skills to make those improvements. So how can we apply these in our own interfaces, especially when people are trying to use the things we design in high-stress moments? Well, one place that we can look is the classics, right? The emergency stop button. Simple, iconic, in use in factories around the world for over 50 years. There are many lessons that we can learn from these iconic emergency designs. Why does this work? Well, first of all, it is playing into that gross motor improvement. It's very large. It's got that unique mushroom-headed shape. It's popping up off the panel. This is a button that is made to be slapped like you are in a game show. It's taking advantage of the gross motor improvement. The other thing that it has going for it is it's highly standardized. In fact, the color red is associated with the concept of stop around the world because of this button. Essentially, if you have factories in your button, you have this. If you have factories in your country, you have this button, and so you get to the idea that red means stop, even if you're in a country like China, where red has other strong cultural associations. And finally, it's a physical control. For the vast majority of examples, physical controls are going to outperform digital or screen-based controls. Sorry, app designers, that's the world we live in. That does not mean, however, that you can't borrow what works about this, apply it to digital designs to kind of get the most out of it, right? So you do things like enlarge your buttons, give them plenty of white space, take advantage of those gross motor improvements. The other thing you want to do is to make your designs as intuitive as possible, because when designing for a stress response, intuition is your golden compass. Now, this is something that has been being addressed specifically in the medical field right now when it comes to alarm design. So I don't know how much you guys have heard about this, but alarm design is actually reached kind of a desperate state a few years ago in the medical community. A study was done that showed that up to there was a critical level alarm every 90 seconds. And pretty much every alarm that sounded was some variation of this sound. Yeah. The electronic beep. Yes, it varied in pitch or pattern, but studies were showing that the medical staff could not distinguish between all of these different sounds, and they're going off constantly. This was leading to chronic alarm fatigue, and a 2013 study showed that it was linked to hundreds of patient deaths. So the medical community put out the call, and that call was answered by designers and researchers from around the world. Now, they have gathered together, and they've been working on this problem for several years now. They're attacking it from all ends. So some people are trying to reduce the number of alarms. Some people are trying to coordinate the alarms across devices. But one of my favorite pieces of work is done by Dr. Judy Edworthy. She was named the godmother of alarm design by the New York Times. So she and her colleagues, they did work trying to create more intuitive, what they called sound icons. Okay, so what they did is they took sounds from everyday life and then they paired them with an associated medical concept. For instance, the sound of a rising tea kettle might tell you that your patient's temperature was getting too high. That might sound something like this. I'm going to play that one more time. The sound of a rattling plastic pill bottle might tell you that your patient's medication was getting low. And then there is this sound. Pretty sure that means the Death Star is attacking. Pretty sure. So these sounds so outperformed their beeping counterpoints that they are now entered as the new international standard for alarms on medical devices. So it's a fantastic work that Dr. Edworthy and her colleagues have done. Okay, so let's talk about ways to suppress the stress response. One of the most effective ways to suppress the stress response is actually through training. Now, training, for better or worse, is a specialty of our US military. They have put billions, if not trillions of dollars into research trying to figure out how to get the peak performance out of soldiers, even in the highest of stress situations. And now the techniques that have been discovered and researched by the military can actually be applied to any high-stress industry, honestly, for high-stress or low-stress jobs. But to do so, you need to really understand how people learn. Okay, so we're going to talk about two main ways of learning. The first is in a classroom or conference setting like this. When you learn things in a classroom setting, you're primarily learning that information in your prefrontal cortex, where your logic and reason sit. Humans are unique in this. We are one of the only species on the planet that can hear a story about what some other idiot did and learn not to do that thing ourselves. The other way that humans learn things is to actually do the thing. Now, this is how most creatures on the planet learn. And when we learn this way, those memories and lessons are stored in our hippocampus, our midbrain. This is often called the home of our intuition, because this is where all of our experiential memories are stored. And now, what's interesting is when we go through a stress response, the blood in our brain moves differently. And the oxygen moves, actually all throughout our body. The oxygen moves away from our extremities and into our core. So in our bodies, that means that our fingers get cold and stiff, and our gross motors get superpowered for running and punching. In our brains, a similar thing is happening. It's pulling the oxygen away from the outer parts of the brain, where things like the prefrontal cortex are, and it's pulling it in towards the center portion of the brain, where things like the hippocampus are. So in effect, what this does is it gives a megaphone to your intuition in stressful moments, and it makes your logic and reason kind of hard to hear. The soldiers refer to this effect as the fog of war. And it's one of the reasons why it is so essential that we train soldiers about when to shoot and, most importantly, when not to shoot while they are on their feet with a weapon in their hands. And the training that they put these soldiers through that has fundamental principles underlying it that can be applied to other types of training. So the things, obviously, first thing that really works about this, hands-on, right? You want this training to be as hands-on as possible. You want to incorporate lots of repetition because having those experiences over and over is what gets it into the muscle memory, makes it intuitive. That's what builds that experiential memory base. Give lots of fast feedback. That's just a general rule for any time you're trying to teach something. The faster the feedback loop is, the faster they learn the lessons. And finally, you want the trainings to be as realistic as possible. Actually getting somebody's heart rate going a little bit in a training session helps them reach a state where it will be easier for them to remember when they reach that stressed out state again. So when we're developing trainings, it's essential that we're thinking about exactly what are we training into people, right? We gotta be careful about this. So this is a CPR dummy. Raise a hands, how many people have gone through CPR training? I hope lots of you, because it's been shown to double or even triple people's chance of survival when having a heart attack. So I'm going to share a statistic with you all, and I want you to see if you can figure out what is this CPR dummy missing, all right? The statistic is 45% of men will receive CPR from bystanders, but only 39% of women will receive CPR from a stranger. So what is this dummy missing? Boobs. The answer is boobs. Yes, this mannequin has no breasts. In order to properly administer CPR to a woman, you are supposed to rip open her shirt and put your hand directly over her left breast. Some people worry that they will be seen to be doing something inappropriate, and it holds them back in this critical moment. So, of course, that is not their logic and reason, right? That is a feeling that they are following. If we think about it logically, the ethical decision here is to save a woman's life rather than to protect her modesty. But in that moment where, like, a woman falls to your feet in front of you, it is not your logic and reason at the forefront. That is a moment when intuition is running the show and it feels wrong, so people hesitate, they freeze. Now, to address this problem, a group called the United State of Women, along with a creative agency called Joan, created Whoa Mannequin. It is a low-cost wrap that can be added to any flat-chested CPR dummy. This gives people a chance to practice with a full-figured figure in their CPR training and get used to the idea, have a chance to ask questions, and be reassured during the training that what they are doing is, in fact, the correct thing to do in that moment. Think carefully about the biases that may be lurking within the trainings that you are creating, because bias is powered by intuition, and that only gets stronger when we are stressed. But the good news is hands-on training is one of the best ways to reset those biases and build new intuitions and correct some of those biases that may be there. All right. So now we're at protect. Sometimes we can't train people, right? It's just not possible. And sometimes there's not great opportunities to harness. Sometimes things go really, really wrong, and people panic. Panic strips us of our cognition, of our ability to think. Now, I had read plenty of studies on this, but this message really hit home to me when a friend of mine actually shared something that had happened to her. So she was home one day with her 2 kids. It's a nice summer day. They're just wandering around the house. I think she's cleaning upstairs. Her little son, 4-year-old son's following her from room to room. They're in the bedroom. She pops out for a second, grabs something, she comes back in, and the room is empty. Kid's not in there. And there's no screen on the window anymore. She said, I knew exactly what had happened. She runs over, she looks down, and her 4-year-old son is lying still on the pavement 2 stories below. She starts screaming his name. She runs down the stairs, through the kitchen, grabs the cordless phone on her way out the back door, kneels down next to him. He is breathing, but he is otherwise not responding. And she is losing her mind. She looks down at the phone in her hand, and her fingers are so stiff, she can barely hold it. And she told me, I will never forget this. She told me, Katie, I couldn't find the 9. She couldn't even find it to call 911. So around this time, her older son had heard her screaming, and so he comes up to her, and she holds out the phone to him, and she says, you have to do it. You have to call 911. It was her 8-year-old son who saved his brother's life that day. He's the one who called the ambulance. Now, this was over a decade ago. The story has a happy ending. A couple nights in the hospital, and the kid is A-okay to this day. But that story drives home to me how much we lose in those moments, how much can get stripped from us. And as designers, we have to think, how do we help in those moments? How can we make sure that things like that don't happen to the people who are turning to our systems for help? So to understand this, so the cause of this panic and the fogginess of war is a neurochemical called cortisol. Now, cortisol has many effects, some positive. It is a driving cortisol. We literally wouldn't get out of bed in the morning without it. It drives us to take action. But at the extreme end of the scale, it can cause issues. So one of the things that pushes us to do is to make faster decisions, of course. That means they're less well considered. It also pushes us towards black and white thinking, which reduces our ability to think creatively for different problem solving. It reduces our understanding and ability to learn new things, and reduces our ability to retain the things that we do learn. And finally, it increases aggression significantly, especially to people we don't consider part of our personal tribe, which makes it hard to listen to reason in those moments. So, as taken all together as a whole, cortisol tends to decrease our decision-making capacities. So I talked to a designer who thinks about designing for people in high states of cortisol a lot. Her name is Jackie Wolf. She's the one in front in plaid there. Now, she works at Michigan Medicine, and they are a research hospital. And a researcher there had come up to her and her group, and that researcher was from pediatric oncology, so kids with cancer, yeah? And they had done a study of parents with children who had been enrolled in a phase 3 clinical trial there, and that survey had come back with some concerning results. Only 50% of the parents could explain the goal of the trial that their child was enrolled in. 66% didn't realize they had a choice. I guess they thought if they didn't sign their kid up, they just wouldn't get treatment. And 1 in 5 didn't even realize their child was enrolled. So to understand how something like this can happen, it's important to think about the experience of these parents. When a child is diagnosed with cancer, those first 48 hours are a whirlwind. Usually parents have been in the hospital for days on end. They are sleep deprived, and they have just heard one of the scariest diagnoses a parent can hear. And it is in this state that they are approached by clinicians asking, would you consider enrolling your child in a phase 3 clinical trial? Their brains are practically soaking in cortisol at this point, but they have to make that decision before their kid can start treatment. And at most, they'll have maybe 1 night to review a dense 30-page disclosure agreement. So things like this, phase 3 clinical trials, have taken the childhood survival rate of leukemia from 35% up to 90%. So obviously, the upside to humanity is great, but would you enroll your sick child in an experiment? I mean, that is a difficult decision. And it's critical from an ethical standpoint that parents understand what it is that they are agreeing to. So what a phase 3 clinical trial really is once a child receives their diagnosis, the parents are asked if they'd enroll in the trial. If they say yes, that child is randomly placed in one of 2 arms of the experiment. One arm gets the standard treatment, and the other arm gets the standard treatment plus a very small change. There is no placebo group here. We are looking for maybe a 1 or 2 percentage point improvement. Sometimes they're just looking to reduce side effects. If the parent says no, that is no problem, and the kid still gets the standard treatment. Now, I just explained phase 3 clinical trials. to you using a chart that Jackie and her team designed. This is the original chart given to parents to explain the procedure. I always get gasps on this one, so it's that bad. So obviously, starting from a place like this, knowing how important this work was, when Jackie first sat down to approach this work, she turned to an old friend, the library. She hit the stacks and looked at all the available medical research she could get her hands on about designing for situations like this. And what Jackie and her team discovered were a series of principles that guided their work. So first of all, they found that video, print, digital, all of these mediums, from a statistical standpoint, had pretty similar comprehension and retention rates. Now, what did make a difference was if that medium was interactive. So clicking through things, even turning pages, increased the retention rate for the consumption of that content. It also, having a mix of words and visuals helped. Breaking up the content into bite-sized chunks. Obviously, that's just basic good content design. And then having a human lens, so using a conversational tone and having characters that the parents could relate to within sort of the story that they were telling. So Jackie's team put all of these ideas together and came up with what I think is a pretty clever solution. They created comics. So this puts all of the research to work. They storyboarded out a conversation between parents and a doctor, and this leans right into the research, right? It breaks up the content into bite-sized chunks. It's interactive because they're clicking through the different panels. It's a very conversational tone because it's in a literal conversation. It has these characters that invite the parents to sort of project themselves. They're vaguely drawn kind of on purpose so that people can kind of see themselves in these parental characters. I think this is a fabulous example of taking the research available and applying it to help people make the best decisions possible, even in a moment where they are trying to deal with complexities far outside of what their brain actually wants to deal with in those moments. All right, finally, we are at calm. So when creating designs that try to calm people down, it's probably helpful to know, how does calming down work, right? When we get excited about something or we have that adrenaline rush, that happens, that adrenaline cortisol, it's dumped into our bloodstreams in milliseconds. But it has to be filtered out of our bloodstream through our kidneys and liver. So it actually takes quite a bit of time, 20 minutes to hours, depending on the severity of the stressful event. And all through this recovery period, people's behavior is being affected. We've talked about this. Reduced cognition, inability to learn new things, increased aggression, right? So as designers, of course, we want to shorten this period as much as possible. Now, the good news is there is lots of available research to say that the aesthetics of our design can actually impact and shorten the amount of time it takes people for this recovery period. So one of the first aesthetic changes that we can make is very simple. We can just round the corners of our buttons and boxes. I know this seems too simple to be true, but there is an MRI study backing this up that showed that people looking at pictures of objects with sharp corners, that triggers the amygdala and the stress response. Pictures of similar objects with rounded corners, it makes people feel comforted. It has a measurable effect on stress levels. Order and clarity, introducing a lot of order and clarity in your designs. Humans, especially when we're stressed, we want to know everything has a place and be able to see that everything is in its place. This gives us a great sense of control and helps calm us in stressful moments. And finally, incorporating natural elements. So this could be pictures of nature. It could be earth tone color palettes. It could just be animations that are inspired through natural movements. All of these have been shown to help calm users. So as designers, we may not be on the front lines. We may not be the soldiers fighting the wars or the doctors trying to cure a pandemic or the astronauts leaving the safety of our little blue marble. But If we are mindful and careful in the way that we approach our designs, we can be there for people when they need us most. We can help protect them, we can calm them, and we can harness the full potential inside them, helping them to do truly amazing things. Thank you.